and I want freedom, and I don't want to be kissing Putin's ring. I don't want the Kremlin and a dictator ruling me. I've got free. And by the way, this is also on Putin's mind. If Ukraine is successful as a free and democratic country, aren't Russians going to look over the fence and say, we want that too? He can't have that. He doesn't want that. What a danger to him and to his whole concept.
Mainstream media gives you the impression that there is nothing good about America. In direct contrast to that, my podcasts will prove by examples that America has always been and still is the land of opportunity for everyone.
Welcome back to another episode in the series Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. This particular episode is a follow-on episode to a prior one that we did with Cliff May, the founder and chairman of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. There was just so much to talk about that we decided to have two episodes, and this is part 2. Welcome back, Cliff.
Thank you, Dr. Bob.
More on the Middle East. In 2009, which was less than 8 months after President Obama became president, he was awarded the Nobel Prize without any indication of what he had accomplished to receive that honor. In contrast, President Trump led the successful effort to get Arab countries to sit down with Israel, and in late 2020, he met that objective when the UAE, United Arab Emirates, signed an agreement with Israel, and soon after that, 3 other Arab countries, Sudan, Morocco, and Bahrain, did the same thing. The Abraham Accords essentially is a peace agreement that ended the ongoing hostilities between those Arab countries and Israel. Obama received the Nobel Prize for delivering nothing, but President Trump, who brought peace to the Middle East, received only criticism. Can you explain why that is?
I think you could probably explain it better than I, but I'll do it in a nutshell. Obama won the Nobel Prize for getting elected president, for being the first Black or mixed race American president, and people and the Nobel Committee liked what he sort of stood for, what he claimed to stand for, and so they gave it to him. You know, sometimes a prize is a tip, sometimes a prize sometimes a prize is a bribe, but I mean, they gave it to him in anticipation for being himself. Obama has often been rewarded for being who he is, and because they were pleased to see him. That's all it was. And the achievement of the Abraham Accords, which is absolutely historic and significant, there's no way that was going to be rewarded because President Trump gets the credit and President Trump is President Trump. Again, it was about, in both cases, it's about the personality rather than the policies or the achievements.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. Now let's talk about Saudi Arabia. In 2003, Dory Gold, who was a guest on our show, a former ambassador from... smart guy. A former...
I love Dory.
He was an ambassador from Israel to the UN, and he published a book entitled Hatred's Kingdom, in which he had lots of evidence. I would say he proved that Saudi Arabia was a major funder of terrorism. Now, in stark contrast, I was just invited to attend a reception in your offices in D.C. at FDD to meet the Royal Princess Rima Al Saud, Saudi's ambassador to the United States. So, Cliff, what transpired in the last 20 years to change hatred's kingdom into a friendly kingdom? What happened?
So, okay. I got to give you a little bit of history here.
Oh,
it's
perfect.
Very relevant.
Wonderful.
So, in 1979, the same year that there was this Islamic revolution in Iran, something very significant took place in Saudi Arabia. It was called the Siege of Mecca. Oh. And there's a book I highly recommend to you and everybody else here, if you haven't read it, called The Siege of Mecca. by Yaroslav Trofimov, who may be the best living foreign correspondent now. He works for the Wall Street Journal, reporting most recently from Ukraine. I don't necessarily agree with everything that Yaroslav believes and says, but he's a brilliant foreign correspondent. And it's about the siege of Mecca. Now, why didn't we know about that? What was the siege of Mecca? There was this group in Saudi Arabia of what I would call ultra Wahhabis, Wahhabi being the kind of Islam that has traditionally been practiced in Saudi Arabia, right? And they were ultra Wahhabis, and the leader of it considered himself the Mahdi, the savior, and in an Islamic way, the kind of the Messiah. And they were trying to take over the country, and they took over Mecca, and the Saudis police and the Saudi security forces went in and couldn't do it, couldn't get them out. They had it. It was Mecca was under siege, and eventually the Saudis went to the French and said, "Can you help us?" And they said, "Maybe our special forces could do it." And the special forces eventually went into Mecca, and in very bloody battles managed to wipe them out. But again, there was no reporters weren't allowed to go to Mecca. You can't go to Mecca unless you're a Muslim. People weren't reporting on that. Reporting on Saudi Arabia was very difficult. They didn't know about it. The Saudis didn't want people to know about it. We had all the news of what was going on in Iran at that point. Okay, so people didn't know about it. But if you read The Siege of Mecca, Yaroslav absolutely tells you it's really worth reading. It's not a long book. What happened, and it's really quite fascinating. Now, after that, what happened? Well, because the Saudis saw that, because they saw what was happening in Iran, they thought, "Oh boy, we're in some serious trouble here." People, Muslims around the world, don't see us as supporting Islam and supporting jihad. We have to establish or reestablish our bona fides as Islamists, as jihadis. And for the next 10, 50, whatever years, they began spending billions of dollars supporting madrasas in Pakistan that would train young Muslims to be jihadis, to be suicide bombers, to be fighters for Islam, to be all of that. They began to do terrible, and to cut a little bit to the chase, I remember speaking to a prominent Saudi official about all this in a very frank fashion, and what he said was, "Look, Cliff, the truth is, we created a Frankenstein monster, and it attacked you on 9/11, and it has attacked us. But now we understand what we did. We're not doing it any longer, quite the contrary." And this gets back to something I was saying before that I had been thinking about ever since being a reporter in '79 in Iran, because that was a revolution that was Shia and predominantly Persian, but it had a galvanizing effect on the Arab and Sunni world, because a lot of people, I don't know what we're saying, what a humiliation. Here is the first modern nation state committed to jihad against the West since the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And it is Shia and Persian, not Arab and Sunni. Where is our jihadi nation? It's supposed to be the Saudis, but the Saudis are too busy shopping in Paris, skiing in Saint Moritz, and drinking whiskey with their infidel friends in Washington. And from that seed, Al-Qaeda was born. Okay? From that seed, Al-Qaeda was born. Now, at this point, the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, here's what you have to understand about him. He is a sincere reformer. He is not a sincere democratizer. He is the Crown Prince. He means to be king, and he means to be king when he's 87 years old or 97-year-old, as long as he lives. And when he gets to that age, he wants to have transformed his country. That's as he sees it, his mission. He's not going to be just a figurehead monarch. He's going to. So you challenge him. You're going to be sorry. But what he is trying to do, unlike Iran, is build Saudi Arabia as an important nation state, economically, politically, in other ways. He's trying to build a nation out of it. Again, Khomeini was not trying to build Iran as a nation. as far as he said, in fact, he did say, this is a quote, what Khomeini said, patriotism is paganism. Because if you love your country,
you don't love Allah.
You don't love Islam.
I see.
And he was, and for the sake of Islam, if Iran had to burn, again, his quote was, let it burn. Doesn't matter. That's not, but the Saudis are trying to build a nation. And I have to say, from what I've learned and what I've seen, and people, with young people in Saudi Arabia, they find this project of building a nation very inspiring, and want to be part of it. A little like Israelis, we're building a nation. What a project! This is something to commit my life to. I want to build a nation. Now, I'm not going to tell you I know that it's going to succeed. I don't know, but that's what he wants. So
the change from the kingdom of terror to the friendly kingdom, it's because of MBS or MBL, whatever he's called.
It's definitely very much attributable to him. It's also, listen, the Saudis are at least as much as the Israelis existentially threatened by the Islamic Republic of Iran, which sees the royal family as interlopers. Who are they to be the custodians of Mecca and Medina? Who are they? They have grievances. Actually, to be fair, their grievances are not unjustified, because the eastern part of Saudi Arabia is largely populated by Shia Muslims.
Oh, I wasn't aware of this.
And where is most of the oil in Saudi Arabia?
Oh, eastern part.
Can you guess?
Oh.
In the eastern part of the country. And you think the Shia Muslims are hugely rich because of it? No, they're not. They're not. And are they oppressed? I think you might want to say that they're not first-class citizens in most cases. You don't see many Saudi Arabians of Shia persuasion in the diplomatic corps or on the highest level of government. Okay, so for all these reasons, they are existentially threatened. Now, one of the things look, the Saudis and the U.S. have had a deal that goes back to Valentine's Day, 1945, when the Saudi king met with Franklin Delano Roosevelt on an American ship in the Suez Canal. And essentially the deal that they struck, the arrangement they struck, was this: we will provide security for Saudi Arabia. You will keep oil flowing at reasonable levels and reasonable prices, because we have to restore the world economy. We want to keep the world economy prosperous after that, and oil is vital for that purpose. And that was the deal. And then, as we've discussed, that deal, who reneged on that deal? President Obama reneged on that deal, didn't he? He wasn't going to protect the Saudis from
and
Iran.
That President Obama was moving the U.S. closer to Iran, to their enemy, Iran.
Exactly. Right. So now, one of the things that has made the Saudis think is, okay, if we can't rely on the U.S., we could use some friends. Let's see who has a significant military power in this region, and also is threatened by Iran. And there is one nation like that. I think it's called Israel, isn't it? And they're not going anywhere, the Israelis, are they? No,
and they're not going to cuddle up to Iran. That's for sure.
And they're not going to cuddle up to Iran. Right. So on a very sub rosa, very level, the Saudis and the Israelis have been reaching out, but they're reaching out much more at this point. I mean, they've gotten much closer. I think we at FDD have helped that process.
Fantastic.
To facilitate that process in various ways as good brokers. To both. I hope that now I think we want to continue to do that, because these two nations do have a great deal in common. And Netanyahu is very aware of this. By the way, I think his second mission, he's made this clear, is he'd like to see real, serious détente, real normalization of relations with the Saudis. He would like to achieve that if he possibly can.
Another topic: Russia and the Ukraine. It's nightly news, the ongoing war between the two. Now, as I understand it, you were in Ukraine in 2019 as an observer of the presidential election. So first, how did you get appointed to be an observer? And what does an observer do besides observe?
Well, observing is a big job, I got to tell you. So there are two groups that do election observing. One is called the International Republican Institute, the other the National Democratic Institute. They're both under the National Democracy, NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. It's common. Anyhow, they various these groups do, and you have a procedure that you follow. What I was doing, so I was along with a group. There were Democrats and Republicans against from these two institutes. You're assigned to a particular city in Ukraine, and you see, are they following the procedures? Are they what are those procedures? Are they taking this seriously? Are there reasons to believe? You don't know everything, but are there reasons to believe that this is a legitimate election? When people, various things you take your notes in the various ways you can see to a reasonable extent. You're observing to see if they seem to be taking this seriously and in disciplined fashion. And I mean, just to give you a quick answer, my goodness, the Ukrainians were so serious about this and kind of proud that they were undertaking this and doing this in a systematic way. And I think they had voter ID. Oh my God, can you imagine? To make sure people were voting and voting once, and that they were keeping their records and everything. And people were very thrilled to be doing this. And by the way, we get there early, so you have time to interview people from the various political parties and see polling and talk about their different positions and how they're getting their word out. And you learn, I mean, it's a very good learning experience for those of us who are there. And I had been to Ukraine before that too. I was also, I was a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. You're either appointed to that by the president or by a congressional leader. I was appointed by Mitch McConnell. And one of the trips I took was to look at religious freedom in Ukraine. And there was considerable good religious freedom in Ukraine, and looked from there into Russia, where their religious freedom was quite restricted. So I had some knowledge. And as you may know, I have been following and studying the Soviet Union for quite a long period of time. I first went there as a teenager to the Soviet Union in the summer of 1969. So that's a long time ago. And then I was an exchange student in Leningrad, it was called in those days, St. Petersburg now, back in 1972. And then I was there as a journalist a little bit. And I've had a connection with that.
So part of the world. You've had experience, evidently, both in the Ukraine and in Russia. You speak, I think you speak Russian. Is that correct? So that sounds like ordering vodka, I think. That's what, yeah.
Actually, it's just just what I've done, but with a little bit of mixture, right?
So you have more insights into this war than most people. And what's your take? Why, in the first place, did Putin invade Ukraine? What did he want to accomplish? So I mean, here's a guy. Wait a minute. Here's a guy who's got to be a billionaire, right? Extremely wealthy, right? Can do whatever he wants. Why not live life and run Russia? Why create aggravation for yourself?
In a certain way, you've just explained it, but I'll take it apart and put it back together to show you. So you are Vladimir Putin. You're one of the richest men in the entire world. No law applies to you. You not only can kill people if you don't like them, you do kill people that you don't like, both at home and abroad. Nothing at all. You have everything you could possibly want, but no. So what does such a person think about? Well, I think Dr. Bob, better than most people. You want to think about your legacy, right? What are you going to achieve? What is going to be said about you afterwards that you achieved in your life? And I think I do understand this. He thought, I know what my job is. I know who I am. I'm the Tsar. And it is the obligation of a Tsar in good times to expand the Russian Empire. That's what the Tsars did. That's what Peter the Great did, and that's who he looks to. He talks about Peter the Great. And in bad times, what's your job? To restore the Russian Empire, to its former power and glory. Not so different from what we're talking about with Iran, right? And so how do you do that? Well, the proper title for a Tsar is Tsar of all the Russias. All the Russias, what does that mean? Well, it means Russia proper. It means Belarus, which is white Russia, which is a vassal state right now under a dictator, Lukashenko, who's been propped up by Putin because he lost the last election but wouldn't admit it. So, okay, Russia, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, which literally would mean the frontiers, the outskirts of Russia, right? Mm-hmm. And he believed, if I'm going to restore the Russian Empire, most important of all, I've got to reincorporate Ukraine into Russia. And those are Russians there. And how dare they not admit it? How dare they think of themselves as anything else but Russians? Yeah, maybe they're country bumpkin Russians. Maybe they're Russians from, from the boondocks, but they're still Russians. I mean, I'll tell you, this is interesting. Early on, Putin said, when he thought he was going to conquer Ukraine very quickly, he said to them, it is, in Russian, it is your duty, my beauty. What does that mean? It is your duty, my beauty. Well, it's what a sort of old Russian peasant would say to his young bride, right? It is your duty, my beauty. I understand what that means. I don't think I need to explain further, right? Okay. So what? So right. In other words, you have to do what I tell you because I'm the mujik, I'm the man, and posters went up around Ukraine, and it showed a beautiful Ukrainian woman.
And they are beautiful. I've seen many of them.
Beautiful, right. A lot of beautiful Ukrainian women. And next to her, but on his knees, is Putin. And his hands are handcuffed behind his back. And this beautiful Russian woman has a pistol, and it's in his mouth. And she is saying to him, "Я тебя не красавица. I am not your beauty."
Wow.
You understand? Wow. I will not submit to you. I will not submit to you, old man. I will not. Keep in mind, he's as you say, he's rich, but he's also, he's not young. He's about like 70 years old. He's not in good health. Look at his pictures now and a few years ago. Right. He's puffy. He's taking some
steroids.
Kinds of medicine.
Right.
You know that? Good. So he's thinking what? So he thought he could do it in 3 days. And by the way, he had good reason to think it in 3 days. Most analysts at the CIA and others said, "Oh yeah, he can take that country in 3 days." Why? Don't forget, in 2014, he took Crimea like that. Right? There was no resistance. He took it, and then he started an insurgency in the eastern part of the country in Donbass, and that insurgency has continued from 2014 to the present. So he thought, this is the Russian military. Who are the Ukrainians? He never expected to get the kind of resistance he got. But this is what he's trying to do: restore the Russian. And if I want to be fair, he has a point in the following. The Russian population of Russia is about 140 million or so, and it's declining very fast. And it doesn't have much of it doesn't have a dynamic. He looks to Ukraine and thinks, if I can get Ukraine, and I have Belarus as my vassal, but in Ukraine, it's a breadbasket, and there's 40 million more Russians that I can have. And I'll have this land, and I'll have Odessa, which was a city established by Catherine the Great. I mean, I will have achieved something enormous, and Russia will survive and thrive. And I'm not sure it will if I don't, because look what's happening to this country. It's deteriorating.
I see.
That's how. So it's very logical, everything he has done, if you think about it this way, right?
And but what about the Ukrainian people? Do they speak Russian? Do they consider themselves Russian? Evidently, they don't want to be Russian, or the war would have been over, right?
So this is absolutely fascinating. So Ukrainian patriotism, a Ukrainian sense of nationality, has been arising for centuries, I would say, but it increased greatly, particularly from the Soviet period, particularly in the 1930s, when Stalin found that the Ukrainian farmers, the peasants, we didn't want to collectivize, were not buying into communism, didn't want to live on collective farms, wanted their own land. They were resisting him. And he decided, okay, I'll teach them a lesson. I'll take their grain and I'll starve them. And he began a famine in the 1930s, the Holodomor, death by famine, and he starved 3 or 4 million Ukrainians to death. And they have, believe me, they haven't forgotten that. And by the way, I say to you and to your, there's a film called Mr. Jones, which is a really wonderful film about exactly this. It's based on reality. British Welsh journalist goes to Russia and he wants to see if the famine is really taking place, but he's barred by the Soviet authorities, but he sneaks down. Spoiler alert, of course, he does find out that the famine is taking. Can I tell you one scene from the movie?
Yes, please. This is fascinating.
Okay, so he goes down there and he got rid of his minder and he begins to see what's going on. And he goes to this little basically hut, and there's young people in there and they're surviving just kind of barely, but they're very cordial to him. And he sits down and they serve him lunch, and he's kind of amazed because he thinks that there's a famine going on, and the stew they're giving him, it contains meat. And he says, I thought things were so bad here. How did you get meat? And they say, a brother. He says, oh, how did your brother get the meat? And they said, no, it's our brother.
Oh.
Yeah, the brother had died,
Oh.
and they were eating him. This was cannibalism. There was a lot of cannibalism because people were starving to death.
A true story, you think, or a parable? Close.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Were people starving there?
Wow.
Was there really this journalist? Yes, there was.
Right.
Did he discover for sure that the famine was going on? Yes, he did. Did Walter? One of the characters in the movie is Walter Durante, who was the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, who was a total pawn of Stalin's and won the Pulitzer Prize for it. Who denied that there was any famine taking place.
That must have been published in the New York Times, right?
It was published in the New York Times. He got it, he was, and he lived very well in Moscow because Stalin liked what he was reporting. So this is all based. So there was cannibalism. It's based on truth.
Okay.
So this is part of it too. But let me go further. In Ukraine, whether you spoke Ukrainian or Russian, I would say the distinction is a little bit like Italian to Spanish. It kind of depended on where you lived. So if you lived in Western Ukraine, you definitely pretty much spoke Ukrainian. In Eastern Ukraine, you probably spoke Russian. In Kiev, we call it Kiev rather than Kiev because Kiev is the Ukrainian rather than Kiev, the Russian. You probably spoke. The elites and the educated probably spoke mostly Russian among themselves. Some of them might know Ukrainian or not. I think that, Zelensky, I think what we know is that he's had to work on his Ukrainian to make it really good because it's not. But the second biggest city after Kyiv is Kharkiv, which is up in the northeast, right on the Russian border. Putin absolutely thought that Kharkiv would totally bend to him because it's absolutely a Russian-speaking city. And what happened is people said, yeah, I may not speak good Ukrainian, but I'm still Ukrainian. I don't whatever. That's not the point.
Wow.
And I want to vote, and I want to have political parties, and I want freedom, and I don't want to be kissing Putin's ring. I don't want the Kremlin and a dictator ruling me. I've got free. And by the way, this is also on Putin's mind. If Ukraine is successful as a free and democratic country, aren't Russians going to look over the fence and say, we want that too? He can't have that. He doesn't want that. What a danger to him and to his whole concept of how he's anti-democratic, as Xi Jinping is anti-democratic, as Khamenei is. And these are all authoritarians, and they're believing authoritarians, right? They're not, it's not that they're not wannabe Democrats. So he sees that going on in Ukraine, and he doesn't like it. And the people in places like Kharkiv say, no, we're not your beauty. I don't care that we speak Russian.
So it's really important to the United States then that Ukraine continue and not be occupied by Russia, right? It's important.
I think it's absolutely vital that we not abandon a free and democratic ally of America who wants to be more like America and more like Europe. And by the way, I should also tell you that we have we made a commitment there back. There's something called the Budapest. When the Soviet Union fell apart, there were nuclear weapons in Ukraine. we wanted the Ukraine to give up those nuclear weapons. So we sat down with them. The Russians sat down and said, we want you to give them up. And what do you want in exchange? And what they said is just
freedom.
Everybody, no,
no.
Our territorial integrity will be respected. That's all we want.
Well, right.
And that Budapest memo was signed by America and by Russia. And it was not respected. It was violated in 2014 when Putin took Ukraine. And did we, as signatories to the Budapest memo, say that's unacceptable? No, there were a few sanctions, a little bit of a wrist slap for Putin. We got on with it. We didn't, right? But we did guarantee that's, by the way, the memo also says, well, we'll take it to the Security Council. Well, that's a crazy idea because who's on the Security Council? Russia. It's a permanent member. Makes sense. So for all these reasons, there is, and nobody has ever injected steroids into Ukrainian patriotism or nationalism the way Putin now has.
I see.
Right? Because like when I was there as an election observer, there were pro-Russian parties. And when I talk to people from the pro-Russian parties, they say, yeah, we need good relations. You don't want to poke the bear. And they're our brothers, essentially. They got 13.5% of the vote, as I recall, in the 2019 election.
And they get less now.
That's it. I don't think they'd get 1% now. No, listen, there are always going to be Quislings. There are always going to be traitors. There are always going to be. And by the way, we were talking here at FDD. We had a very interesting meeting with a former, I can tell you a former CIA agent who served in Moscow several tours. I thought he was very smart, very good. His Russian was very good. I spoke to him in Russian a bit. And he said, and they told me something I didn't know. He said, Donbass, which is this eastern section, he said, it's an interesting and different part of the country. You got those there who think of themselves as Russians, those who think of themselves as Ukrainians. And then you got the Cossacks. And that's a whole other thing what the Cossacks are, because the Cossacks, people don't, it's really fascinating. They're basically Ukrainians, but they're not really an ethnic group. They're a warrior tribe. They're mixed Tatar and Turkic and Mongol and Russian and Polish and Ukrainian, all kinds, and they think of themselves sort of differently. They were used by the czars as kind of as expeditionary forces. They were terrible to the Jews. A lot of pogroms were carried out by the Cossacks, but they were this kind of warrior class that under the czars, and there's still people who think of themselves as Cossacks. They don't, at least that's their kind of primary identity, and a lot of them are in Donbass. Anyhow, it's a bit of a confusing situation, and there, as you know, big battles are taking place now. But one in Bakhmut is a very important battle that's been taking place for months and months and months and months, a grinding battle.
Now, many different countries have promised support to Ukraine, and some are delivering support. And Israel, I think, has a history of providing humanitarian support to all sorts of different countries, like even in Turkey today. But so they're providing humanitarian up till now to the Ukraine. But it's been under pressure from the U.S. and other countries to provide military assistance as well. I don't understand why the world is once again ganging up on tiny Israel. As we know, Israel has plenty of military challenges on a daily basis in its own backyard. It simply can't afford to get involved in other countries' wars. And another reason against why they shouldn't provide help to Ukraine is that Ukraine has not been a friend of Israel. I've checked Ukraine's voting record regarding Israel, and I discovered that it's dismal. Since 2015, there have been a total of 133 proposed resolutions against Israel in the UN General Assembly. Ukraine abstained in 21% of those resolutions, but it voted for those resolutions, which means against Israel 79% of the time. In the past 8 years, they have never casted a single vote in favor of Israel. Cliff, can you give us some insight or your ideas or thoughts on why the world is pressuring Israel to provide military support to one side in a war in which neither side is a friend of Israel?
So gross. All I can tell you is that it's grossly unfair for the reasons you stated, and I'll state some more reasons. One is, you kind of alluded to this, Israel is essentially at war at all times. They're at war with Hezbollah. They're at war with Hamas, with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The Palestinian Authority is lost or given up control of the northern West Bank. Secondly, Israel doesn't have a lot of weapons to spare. Thirdly, Israel is not in Europe, and this is a European war. I mean, could France be doing more? Could Germany be doing more? Yes, or the Baltic countries are doing a lot, but Israel's a tiny country in the Middle East, not around there. Second, Putin, there's still quite a few Jews in Russia. Don't think Putin won't hold them hostage. Because you think he's going to say, oh, well, that's nothing to do with Israel. It's our Russian Jew. No, he can hold them hostage. Third, Putin...
the air defense systems in Syria, bring that up.
He's into Syria. Yes, Putin, thanks to the U.S., thanks to U.S. policy, Putin is, along with Iran, the major influence that has saved and propped up the Bashar
al-Assad regime. Yeah,
Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. And the Iranians keep trying to establish another front against Israel. Again, they're trying to surround Israel. So a front in Lebanon, 150,000 missiles and rockets pointing at Israel. You got Gaza. The Iranians are supporting Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, which are infiltrating increasingly in the West Bank
as well. And on the north, so, the Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Hezbollah in Lebanon, all that's going on. But and they're trying to establish another front in Syria. Israel almost nightly hits these targets, hits weapons that are coming into Syria, weapons that may be destined for Lebanon or to be set up in Syria in these forward operating bases. And they need Putin at least to say, okay, nothing to do with us. And they deconflict. And the Israelis may say, this is not an area where Russians should be in the next couple of days. It's a kind of a dangerous place. Okay, God. So they really can't afford to
piss Russia off.
To be provoking Russia in that way. They don't really, and they don't have the weapons to spare. All of these, and again, why is Putin in Syria? Putin's in Syria because Obama essentially said, I'm not going to enforce my red line on chemical weapons.
Right.
And would you, Russia, help me with this? And they said, sure. Yeah. In exchange for, of course, they didn't really, because chemical weapons have continued to be used, but don't get in the way of us going into Syria and establishing and furbishing a warm water port in Syria on the Mediterranean and taking this as our equity. And the U.S. So that's why Russia's in there. And then it's this.
Again, I want to point this out to our viewers. Another failure of Barack Obama. Drew a red line about chemical weapons, and Bashar al-Assad kept on killing people with cluster bombs and chemical weapons. Nothing happened.
And would we say to Jordan, hey, what are you doing for Ukraine? I don't think you're doing enough. I don't think we would say to Jordan. Would we say it to Egypt?
Well, say it to Korea, or Japan.
But by the way, but I also want to add to this. The Israelis have given aid where they can, and humanitarian, but also something else has happened. So the Iranians have been supplying Putin with drones that he's using to kill Ukrainians. Civilians as much as military, maybe even more so, right? Knocking out electricity so they should freeze. So what happened the other day? Well, there's a weapons factory in Iran, in Isfahan. We believe that producing exactly these drones. We just talked about this a little bit. And guess what? It is maybe destroyed or damaged, and the Israelis are not confirming or denying responsibility. But who else do we think?
No, it wasn't me.
Wasn't you? And you could have. Listen, you could have. So what is that? Is that not helping Ukraine? Yeah, that's helping Ukraine a whole lot, isn't it? And look, and the Israelis are pro-Ukrainian despite everything. At least the Israelis, I know. And there's like a million. There are a lot of Ukrainian and Russian Jews who have settled in Israel. Yeah. I go to Israel, I can talk Russian within a lot of cabs, right? And most of the ones I know are absolutely pro-Ukrainian because they understand what Putin's trying to do to them. He's trying to wipe them off the map, just the way Iran, just the way Hezbollah and Hamas are trying to wipe Israel off the map. So they support it, but there's only so much they can do as a tiny little nation in a different region of the world that is at war on a day-to-day basis.
New topic. As I mentioned in your introduction, you were a foreign correspondent posted to over 30 different countries where things were happening, bad things were happening, and you were there. Right? They don't send you to places where good things are happening typically. And you were there to report.
I never got to Bermuda.
Or a missile launch from Cape Canaveral to the moon. I mean, that's a rarity. So I'm sure that you were aware of the dangers and the risks of working in conflict zones. Now, I did a bit of research, again, for this podcast, into the dangers of working in conflict zones and discovered a website of an organization called Reporters Without Borders. They have documented that in the past 20 years, 2003 to 2022, an amazingly high number of journalists, you may not have known this, were killed in connection with their work. 1,668 journalists were killed in connection with their work in conflict zones. And that comes out to an average of 80 reporters killed every year doing their job. Now, they probably didn't understand that before they took the job. They wouldn't have signed up. But at any rate, when those 80 die every year, there isn't an outcry by anyone, not even by the press, maybe even by their own press. There's a note about it. So it's overlooked, except when the reporter works for an Arab news outlet and when the reporter is killed in Israel. So last year, Abu Akleh, a female reporter for Al Jazeera, she was covering a raid by the Israeli Defense Forces on a Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, which is Israel.
On terrorists in this so-called camp.
Right. It's a camp.
It wasn't on refugees.
No, it wasn't on the people in the camp. It was on terrorists in the camp. And unfortunately, she was hit by a bullet in her head that killed her. Now, it happened over 9 months ago, but it's still in the news. And CNN, they say, they held an independent investigation. First of all, who is CNN to hold? It's a news organization. Who are they to hold an independent investigation? And we all know how unbiased and independent CNN is. And they concluded her death was the result of a targeted Israeli killing. Not accidental, targeted. That's what they said. It's absurd. The last thing Israel needs or wants is more bad publicity. If she was killed by an Israeli bullet and there's no proof, we don't know, then it was accidental. By the way, the U.S. State Department conducted its own investigation and concluded that she was likely killed by Israeli fire during a firefight, but they stated there's no reason to believe the shooting was intentional. Nevertheless, just recently, Biden ordered the FBI to conduct yet another investigation into her death. Since when, Cliff, does the FBI have jurisdiction to investigate shootings abroad? And should Israel, a totally independent country, assist them allow it to happen and assist them in investigation? What do you think?
I don't think Israel should. I don't think Israel will. I think it's ridiculous to think this reporter works for Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is owned by the Qataris. The Qataris are pro-Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
Al Jazeera is not,
it's not even the New York Times.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's pretty bad. So, I mean, the Israelis think, oh, she'll be replaced by somebody who's pro-Israel if we just get rid of this one problem. I don't think so. I don't think that's stupid.
Yeah,
right? Oh, this is. Wait, I'm sure we'll get somebody, from Long Island named Ginsburg, who's going to. No, it's no way. I mean, let's cut to the chase on what I think this is: anti-Israelism.
Yeah,
I would say anti-Zionism. I would say is just a a variant of the virus of anti-Semitism.
Yep, same story. It's a variant.
That's, you want to debate that with me, I'm happy to do so, but that's how I see it. And this is, I'm sorry for her, sorry for her family, but yes, I've been in many situations in various places in war zones where it was dangerous, and if the bullets are flying, for my own part, I would duck and take cover. And by the way, braver journalists than me wouldn't. So,
Well, there's a new government in Israel, as you know, and a lot of talk about it, and mostly negative, calling it a right-wing fascist government that Prime Minister Netanyahu has formed. So why is the press so concerned about this government, which was democratically elected by a pretty good majority by the citizens of Israel?
It goes back to what we were just saying, doesn't it? I mean, where else in the Middle East are governments democratically elected?
Right.
And you can
they
say,
don't
I
get
don't
criticized.
And you can say, I don't like some of the people that they elected. Hey, that happens. I don't like some of the people that get elected in this country. You don't either. That's what happens in a democratic system. And then you can say, well, I don't like the policies they favor. Okay, well, we'll see what happens with those. Then you can criticize those policies. If that's what happened, I mean, Netanyahu said, look, I'm the prime minister. That has some meaning in terms of what's going to get done and what's not. There are a lot of debates in Israel. People protest in Israel. They don't get shot for protesting. There are dissenters. That's what happens.
And they're very loud. Not that many, but they're very loud. And the major newspaper, Haaretz, is always against Netanyahu and the right wing. Always.
Listen, there's a considerable left wing in Israel, although
more verbal than numbers these days, I think.
Yeah, well, the voting public, it's not. He doesn't show up in the voting public because years ago, when I was young, when you were young, the Labor Party was a left wing, but was the party, the dominant party, and now it doesn't even get into the parliament, into the Knesset. And Meretz is another left wing party, and they can't also get enough votes to get in. The people have changed. Most voters vote more to the right. Now there are some very far right party. It's a very odd system because you have to form a coalition to get to be
too complicated. It's
very complicated. That's right. And so some can say, well, I don't like all the people that Netanyahu brought into his coalition.
But he had to get 61 votes. He had to get enough votes.
He had to get 61 votes, which is a majority in the Knesset. And as I said earlier, I think Netanyahu believes he has a mission, and that's what he wanted to be prime minister because he doesn't believe anybody else, rightly or wrongly. I'm not saying he believes he has to carry out this mission that is and face the existential threats to Israel's existence. And he's going to do what he needs to do because he too believes he has a legacy, he too believes he has a mission, and that mission is the survival of his country.
Okay. Final topic, Cliff. We're all aware of the breaking news about the China balloon. What's FDD's take on the balloon and the increasingly hostile posture that China has taken against the West?
Well, FDD does take the position that China represents a threat. I would say I would take this. I'll do this big picture for a second, then we'll go specifically to the balloon. H.R. McMaster, who I mentioned to you, is affiliated with us, and Matt Pottinger, who I think is most responsible, more than anybody else, for seeing that China policies of the past were failing and got this across with the help of H.R. McMaster during the Trump administration, that this was not a country that was liberalizing. Neil Ferguson is one of the best living historians. Michael Gallagher, who is a wonderful representative from Wisconsin and is the head of the select committee that's now going to be looking into China. It's a select bipartisan committee. And by the way, he was affiliated with FDD before he was a congressman. I'm very proud to say. So they all agree on the following, that a new Cold War has begun. And it's a more challenging Cold War than the first Cold War, because the Soviet Union was always an economic weakling, but now you've got communist China, which is richer than the Soviet Union ever was, and China is in partnership with Putin. They established that as a formal relationship a year ago this month, a year ago, February. They have a partnership with, quote, no limits. Junior members include Khamenei of Islamic Republic of Iran, who, as we said, he's supplying drones to Russia. Other junior members include Cuba, Nicaragua, certainly Venezuela. This is what is arrayed against us. All of them have the same goal, which is the diminishment, if not the destruction of the U.S., and certainly ending U.S. leadership in the world, which I think is not something we necessarily want, but it's indispensable, it's necessary, there's nobody else. And the thing is, if a Cold War is being waged against you, what's the first thing you need to do? Recognize that reality, it seems to me. Because if somebody's fighting you and you don't realize it, you're unlikely to win. Now, it's not the worst thing in the world to have a Cold War. If you're in a Cold War, what do you try to do? You try to make sure it doesn't become a hot war.
Keep it cold.
Keep it cold. And secondly, you try to win it, and we won the last one. But it better be a priority for you. And is it a priority does the current administration say, yes, there's a Cold War taking place? Does not. You didn't hear Biden say that in his State of the Union. It's not his top priority. His priority is transitioning from fossil fuels to saving the solar and wind and all kinds of other things that he's trying to do. He wants to spend $1 trillion up to or on relieving student loans at the taxpayer expense, and there's the Inflation Reduction Act that doesn't reduce inflation, but is an investment, he says, in climate change, even though it will have no impact on climate change. We can all agree on that. There's no question about that. So we think it's very important to recognize that we have this challenge and this threat, and to make this a priority and do what needs to be done in order to defend ourselves and have this Cold War come out well at the end.
And the failure of the administration of Biden to take immediate action when our borders are being ignored by a player like China. Immediate action. Yeah. Now, on television, you saw the same thing. Oh, we want to take it down safely. And it was over Alaska. It's highly unlikely that it would hit anybody, even a polar bear in Alaska, where the population is so low and where the area is so large. And then it was over, Montana, the central part of the United States. It could have easily been brought down, and rather on land where we could have examined it more carefully, rather than waiting for it to completely pass over the entire United States from Alaska all the way to the East Coast, and then shoot it down over water. The argument that we were worried about people on the ground is specious. And so I don't know why the delay was, but it sends the wrong message to our enemies that you have any hesitation of shooting things down that don't belong there.
And we think it's most likely that this balloon was intelligence gathering and for the purpose of surveillance, but there are other possibilities that we need to at least consider. Less likely, but more dangerous. Could you use a balloon to deliver chemical weapons? Could you use a balloon to deliver biological weapons? Could you use a balloon for what's called an EMP attack, electromagnetic pulse attack? And in a sentence, what that is, it's where you have at a certain altitude an atomic explosion. And what that does is nobody is killed immediately by the explosion, but it fries everything electronic, everything computer, anywhere under the sort of umbrella of that explosion, and it would essentially put you back into the dark ages. There are people I would consider credible who've been talking about this for years. There was a congressionally mandated EMP commission which looked at this possibility. If this is even a remote possibility, even remote, then one of the things you want to do, a very important thing that people who are concerned about EMP, and there's a whole crowd of people who have been saying for years, is we need to harden the grid, and we need to preposition components of the grid in various places around the country. So if we have a blackout over part or all of the nation because of such an attack, we can recover quickly, because if you go without electricity in a country like the United States for a prolonged period of time, people will die by the hundreds of thousands. There's a book about exactly this. It's called 1 Second After by William Fortune. He's a good friend of Newt Gingrich's. I interviewed him actually in a book talk on CNN. And he's a historian, a military historian. He's a professor, and it's a fictional account of what happens 1 second after
an EMP.
Attack.
But even if Cliff, even if they thought that was a possibility, then shooting it down over water wouldn't make any difference. But
the point is to wake up now and say, if there is even a small possibility, shouldn't we? Hardening the grid is a good thing to do anyhow.
Well, that's a good thing, but that's not the story of a balloon that we should have shot down.
No, but maybe it should be a wake up call now, because intelligence gathering by satellites, by balloons. Look, we shouldn't allow it. That's absolutely the case. But if we now understand that and there's a possibility that other balloons have gone over the U.S., we don't really know that. That's kind of because, as you know, certain people said, "Oh, this happened under Trump."
Yeah, right.
And then Trump said, "No, it didn't." No. And then some people have said, "Well, we didn't know it was happening when it was happening," which would be amazing because they should, but we found out later. In other words, NORAD's supposed to know what's going on in the skies. If they miss something like that, and through intelligence we found out about it later, that also should be a wake-up call that we're not doing what we should do. But the most important, and who knows what intelligence they gathered, maybe we'll be able to find out when we see the equipment that hopefully will be recovered. At least it was shot down in shallow water. Everything you said is correct, but the most important thing I would say from a policy point of view is learn from this and correct your mistakes going forward, because if we got a wake-up call about dangers that we didn't understand or didn't perceive, okay, that's good as long as we respond in an effective fashion.
Right. I'm more concerned with the message that it sends to our adversaries that we're paralyzed. Paralyzed for 4 days. Wasn't it 4 or 5 days this item was flying? Well, enough topics for today. Cliff, I want to thank you for spending time with me, and thank you so much more for providing decision makers in our government with timely and deeply researched reports and advice on important policy matters.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Bob. Thank you for all you do.
FDD takes no funds from the U.S. government or from any other government. It relies solely on contributions from citizens who understand the importance of their work and want to help them continue doing it. Please consider a tax-deductible donation. They make it simple. Go to their website, fdd.org, and click on the word invest. And don't think of it as a gift, because it's an investment. It's an investment in FDD and in our country. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, please subscribe and you'll be automatically notified of future podcasts in this series.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate reading your comments on YouTube and social media, and now you can submit your questions on my website as well. Head over to lifelessonswithdrbob.com and click the question tab at the top of the page or the one on the right side of the screen, and let us know what's on your mind. I'll answer your questions at the beginning of each episode, so let it rip. Let's have some fun.